to a positively polar utterance. So it would have, in Rouleau-Sennefark system, it would be agree plus. So if I say in French, Jean est-il venu? Did Jean come? And the other person answers oui, I will understand that yes, Jean came. But then there's a reverse plus particle, which also is translated into English by yes, but which is used for positively polar responses to negatively polar utterances. So if the person said, Jean n'est-il pas venu, with a negation, didn't Jean come? I would say si to convey that he did come. And then there's one particle for negatively polar responses, whether or not independently of the polarity of the preceding utterance, and that's non. So whether or not the question is Jean est-il venu, did he come, or Jean n'est-il pas venu, did he not come, you can answer non to convey that he didn't come. That's the standard account. But things, if you look a little bit closer, it turns out that things are actually more complicated than that. So the distinction between oui and si is not that clear cut. There are some cases where from the standard account, you would expect that people would answer si, but systematically they don't. So with the tag question, n'est-ce pas, which corresponds to English, isn't he, she, it, like, quel acteur, n'est-ce pas, what an actor, isn't he, meaning, you know, don't you think that you do agree with me that he's a great actor, don't you? So n'est-ce pas. With that n'est-ce pas, it's formally negative. It has the ne and the pas, which are it's the standard clause marker and clause negator in French. But if you want to agree that he's a good actor, you will never say si. You will say oui, as you see in the example. Similarly, if the governing clause is n'est-ce pas que, isn't it true that, as in Moïse, n'est-ce pas que tu es un bon petit juif, isn't it true that you're a good little Jew, which is oriented towards a positive response. The person asking the question thinks that Moïse is a good little Jew. You will never say si in French to agree that he is a good little Jew. You will always say oui. And with rhetorical questions, there's variation, but they tend to be a negative rhetorical question, which by definition is oriented towards a positive response, not a positive, it conveys a positive statement, will typically, not always, but typically it will be responded to by oui, as in this example, in this third example here, where somebody says, I think it's a teacher or something like that, says, wouldn't it be better if we talked about something else and not always just about homework? Because that way the child and the parent, so they're trying to convey that they think they should talk about something else than homework. This is a rhetorical question. And the parent then answers oui, bien sûr, even though the question is actually grammatically negative, to agree with the idea that yes, we should talk about something other than homework. And even with straightforward information questions that are negative, if the context is such that there's an expectation of a positive state of affairs, there's variation, but people will often answer we. Here, you could say si in the fourth example, but we is quite common. So they're talking about a house in an area south of France, I guess, where houses typically have swimming pools. And speaker says, "Il n'y a pas de piscine." Is there no swimming pool? Surely there must be. And to convey surely there must be. And speaker M responds, "Piscine, oh oui." Yes, of course there's a swimming pool. So we would expect the C according to the standard account here very strongly, but we do actually get a oui. And that's not at all uncommon. Further problems have to do with the distinction between oui and non. So if you are responding to a series of utterances with different polarities, then oui is the only appropriate answer to the series of utterances as a whole. So if your employer tells you, as in this example, I'll give you this piece of blue paper, that's a positively polar instruction, take it to them, again positively polar, run, positively polar, and then ne le perds pas, don't lose it, this is negatively polar, et ne le déchire pas, don't tear it, this is negatively polar. So we got three positive instructions and 2 negative ones. And the maid in this case to say that yes, I'm going to abide by all of your instructions, she can only answer oui. If she says non, she will only be answering the last 2, which are negatively polar. But to respond to all of them in one go, she has to say oui. Then we have expressions like t'es pas mal, être pas mal, which means to be not bad, which is sort of doubly negative, so it conveys a positive statement by implication. If something's not bad, then basically it's fairly good. And to respond to doubly negative expressions like that, we use oui rather than non, even though the preceding utterance is negatively polar. T'es pas mal non plus dans le genre, it means, idiomatically, you're a lot like that yourself, but literally it means you're not bad yourself that way. And the person to agree with that replies, oui, yes, but I don't smoke. If you give an instruction which is negative in form, but which actually conveys a positive instruction, like ne quittez pas on the phone, which means don't hang up, but also, well, stay on the line. If you don't hang up, the idea is that you should stay on the line, is the basic message. And you will not answer non to an instruction like that. You will answer oui. And then in some cases where somebody says c'est pas logique la phrase, the sentence isn't logical, then to agree with that, you can say non here, non, elle n'est pas logique, that's possible, but it's also very common to say ah oui, c'est ça, to agree, yes, I agree that it isn't logical, there's something wrong here. Then the distinction between when to use si and when to use non after a negatively polar preceding utterance is a bit trickier than the standard account suggests. So if somebody says, suppose you're eating a meal and speaker A sees that speaker B is not really eating, and they say, tu n'aimes pas, you don't like it. And speaker B can then say, si, c'est pas ça, yes, I do. That means, yes, I do like it. That's not why I'm not eating, it's because I'm very full or something. If speaker B had said, non, c'est pas ça, they're not saying whether they like it or not. They're saying it's irrelevant whether I like it. I think there's something poisonous in here, for instance. It may taste good, but we shouldn't eat it because we'll get sick. Might be, depending on the context, might be what was meant by non, c'est pas ça. And then finally, si is overwhelmingly, it is true that si is overwhelmingly used after a negatively polar preceding utterance, but there are actually cases where you can use it perfectly fine so long as the preceding utterance, you can infer something negative from the preceding utterance. So here's an authentic exchange where A says to B, don't you have any money left? And B says, well, listen, I've got 1,000 thingies, but I'm telling you life is expensive. And A says, menteuse, liar. But that menteuse, it's elliptical for you are a liar, which is obviously positively polar. But at the same time, if somebody's a liar, then that you can infer that they are not telling the truth. And so B can answer here, ah si, je te jure, I am telling the truth. Is basically the message here. And these things don't follow from the standard account. And the standard account is basically, the one that's fully compatible with Roelofsen and Farkas's system. But Roelofsen and Farkas's system cannot then explain these facts. So it seems that French, actually much like English, even though it has a third particle, which English doesn't have, also has a fundamentally mixed system, that it's partly polarity-based. It looks superficially polarity-based, but only partly, because there are lots of contexts where actually it seems to be more a good disagreement-based. So both of the models we've looked at neither of them can offer a satisfying account of response particle usage in French. And the funny thing when you think about it is that response particles, if anything, they are the most dialogic items in any language. They function by definition in dialogue. And so to look for an explanation of response particle usage principally in either syntax or semantics and not considering pragmatics is sort of a bit odd. And so I thought, well, let's have a look at pragmatics and also maybe at the history of these items. So diachronic pragmatics, and see if that might help us explain how they work in contemporary French. Now, French is a daughter language of Latin. So I started by looking at how did Latin express yes and no, and Latin didn't have response particles. They used the other two options variously the two alternative options that I explained earlier. So echo constructions are quite common. So non fecit, to say he or she did not. If somebody says, did he or she buy food? Non fecit to mean no, they didn't. Or they could use more general purpose adverbs. They could also use those together with an echo construction. So ita or sic were used for positive responses. So if did he or she buy food, ita or sic, you could say, or kerte, and you could combine that with the verb fecit, ita fecit, yes, he did this, and so on. Modern French, the modern French response particles grow out of these Latin constructions. So the modern French oui in Old French was will with an L at the end. That L has disappeared. It's been phonetically reduced over time, but it's originally will. And that is a fusion of two words, o and il, where o is an old demonstrative inherited from Latin. It doesn't exist anymore. And il is a subject pronoun. So it literally, o il means that he. So that he, you say, did he buy food? That he, so he did that. It's elliptical for he did that. And the Latin clause non is directly inherited from the Latin clause negator non, or I should say, will is lexicalized as a one-word response particle at least as early as 1100. Non is directly from the Latin clause negator non, and in medieval French, just as in Latin, it occurs normally always followed by a verb. Not in every single case, but it's rare to find non without a following verb until the 15th century. There is at least a few examples as early as 1200 of somebody just saying non and nothing further, but usually the verb follows. Sic, si is from Latin sic, which was used, which means thus, and it always occurs in the Middle Ages followed by a verb. So in a kind of particle plus echo construction. And it was not always used to answer negatively polar utterances. In fact, in Old French, it's mainly used to reply to utterances that has positive polarity. So we respond with emphatic agreement to such utterances, as in the example that you see, my lady, I am in love, I cannot deny it, you must advise me well. And the lady replies, si ferai-je, yes, I will, indeed I will. And this si can never occur in the same clause as a negative marker. Responding to a negatively polar utterance with si plus a following verb is first attested in 1155. But its first absolute use without a following verb in the modern sense is from the 16th century. And its frequency in that use, responding to negatively polar utterances, is very substantially lower than that of either oui or non throughout the history of French. So there's a missing link here, actually, because these three modern particles, these are the three that we have left in the modern language. But in the old language, there was actually a fourth particle, which was negative. And it has basically the same structure as will or oui, will. It's ni in more recent texts, but in the Middle Ages it's ni-nil, and it's from non plus il, the clause negator ne or non before vowel plus the subject marker il. So it's the same basic structure as will, oui. They become fused, and it's lexicalized as early as 1130, so roughly around the same time as oui. But it declines very sharply in frequency from the 17th century onwards. It's almost non-existent in contemporary French. People will not use it in spontaneous dialogue. The only examples I have in my database are from most of them from a historical novel, or one or more historical novels. contemporary historical novels. And I think in one or two cases, people using it facetiously for humorous purposes. But basically, Nini is gone from the language. In contemporary French. But what we then had in medieval French was two positive response particles, so will and si plus a verb, and two negative response particles, ninil and non plus or in some cases minus a verb, but typically with a verb. And will and nil have the same structure, and si and non are followed by the verb, at least most of the time. And so they have this echo response structure, which makes you wonder if maybe there was a division of labor between these two pairs. And when you look at, so I looked at some corpus data from a very large electronic corpus called Frontext, which has text from 950 up to 2015. And I did partially sample them after a certain date at 25-year intervals. But I looked at a total of 3,555 examples from the 12th to the 21st century. There weren't any examples of any of these particles before in the data before the 12th century. There's not much data before that time anyway. And as you can see, the normalized frequencies per 10,000 words are very, very different between the four particles. And Nini drops very sharply starting in the 16th century, whereas oui and non increase in frequency, and also si to a certain extent, but to a much lesser extent. And so what happened between medieval French and Renaissance classical modern French? So it turns out that in medieval French, there was a very clear division of labor such that it depended, the use of oui and nini on the one hand or si and non on the other hand, depended on the speech act type of the preceding utterance. So will and ninil were overwhelmingly used in answers to yes-no questions. Yes-no questions are, of course, fundamentally expressed by yes-no interrogatives. So if somebody says, is Charlemagne's treasure ready? Then you have the answer, will sire, yes, it is ready. If somebody asks, ne l'aimes-tu, do you not love him? Ninil says, no, I don't love him. You can also express yes-no questions by an imperative sentence of the form, tell me whether X is the case. And there we get will and ninil as well. So in the third example, the king says, tell me, commoner, if you believe it. And the sage says, will sire, meaning I will tell you, but yes, I believe it. And similarly, in the last example, tell me if you've been beaten. And the answer is ninil voir. That doesn't mean I won't tell you. It means, no, I have not been beaten. So will and nil are used as answers to yes-no questions. Non and si, on the other hand, to a lesser degree, but they are mainly used in responses to non-interrogative speech acts. So like representatives' assertions, as in the first example, I haven't been disloyal to you as far as I'm aware. And the answer is si avez, yes, you have. Or in the second example, I know very well that you take me for a fool. And the answer is non faz, no, I don't. You have directives for this body that lies here must never be removed from its place. We believe in context, this is a directive, you must not remove this body. And the person that this is said to answers, si sera, yes, it will happen. We will remove it. And in the last example, you try if you can remove it. And the answer is non ferai-je. No, I will not try to remove it. So if we quantify the data, we see that oui and nini up until at least the 16th century, the pattern is very clear. Overwhelmingly, they follow yes/no questions, and si and non do so to a much lesser extent, with some more variability for si. Non does so in the 12th century. There's not that much data, and then it drops. So very little data accounts for more than 50% of all the examples in that century. And you can see it drops very sharply in the 13th, 14th, and 15th. The 15th century, there's nothing. And then it starts to rise again when around the time when Nini is dropping out of the language, as we saw earlier. And actually, we can make the pattern even clearer when we consider that some non-questions may actually implicate a question. So we find examples in the data like, we'll take you there if you want, somebody says to the king. And if you want implies the question, what do you want us to take us there? And notice that the king answers the question. Yes, we want nothing else. Yes, I do want you to take me there. So if we include that type of very indirect questions, the patterns become even more clear for being very highly specialized for as responses to questions. So I also considered the notion of pragmatic orientation, because as you can see here, the pattern is not 100%. In any century. So there must be more than this going on than just, the nature of the Speech Act. And so I thought, well, maybe pragmatic orientation has something to do with it. So does speaker 2 have reason to believe that speaker 1 expects the response to have a particular polarity? And if the response conforms to perceived expectations, then I say it's pragmatically harmonious. If it doesn't conform to perceived expectations, I say it's pragmatically disharmonious. And with assertions, requests, orders, non-questions, as it were, pragmatic orientation is a very simple matter to determine. So if the utterance is grammatically positive, it will be positively oriented. If it's grammatically negative, it will be negatively oriented. So if I say to you, Mary's a smart woman, that is oriented towards you agreeing with me. You can disagree if you want to, but you'll have to do more conversational work. If I ask you to show me your new car, it's a positive imperative. I am expecting you to say, sure, I'll take you there. You can, again, refuse to show me the car, but you'll have to do more conversational work. If I promise somebody to be there at 5 o'clock, I expect them to accept my promise, not to start discussing whether I should be there at another time or whether I shouldn't be there at all or something. They can do, but they will have to do more conversational work. And vice versa with if I say John is not a nice person, I expect you to agree that he's not. If I ask you not to smoke in the house, I expect you not to accept that. And if I say I won't breathe a word of this to anyone, I expect that you think that I shouldn't tell anybody. Questions, on the other hand, are more complicated. There is, in parts of the literature, an assumption that the questions are similar to assertions and requests in this respect, but that's not actually true when you look at it a bit more closely, because the orientation of a question can only be determined in context. And it's independent of the polarity of the question. And you can show that by showing that the same question form can be oriented differently according to the context. So if somebody says to me, this weekend I'm going to a workshop on the pragmatics of questions, well, as an academic, I know that typically, there may be exceptions, but typically we go to workshops only if we're interested in the topic of the workshop. And so I can figure out that, yes, A probably is interested in the pragmatics of questions. So if I then answer, oh, tiens, ça t'intéresse? Oh, is that of interest to you? My question is positively oriented. I'm expecting them to say yes. I'm suggesting that I probably didn't know this already, but it's a confirmation question. I've worked out that this must be of interest to them. On the other hand, if you imagine a couple who are divorcing and they really, really do not get along, they're arguing all the time, the divorce is very acrimonious. Suppose they meet they're having a mediation session and they're sitting there around the table, and then the one partner says to the other, did you have a nice day? Just to be polite, very superficially polite. And the other one gets irritated and says, oh, écoute, ça t'intéresse? Does that really interest you? Thinking, given our situation that we're divorcing and we're really not getting along, I don't think you have any interest in whether I had a nice day or not. So here the question, ça t'intéresse, is negatively oriented. And then finally, it can have no orientation at all. For instance, if I've decided that tomorrow I'm going to go see a film with an actress called Isabelle Huppert, And I mean, this is a firm decision. I like her films. Tomorrow is when I have the time, so this is what I'm going to do. And then a friend says to me, would you like to get together tomorrow? And I say, well, I'd like to go to see the new movie with Isabelle Huppert. Ça t'intéresse? Is that of interest to you? Meaning that if it is, why don't you come along? If it isn't, we'll have to find some other time. I don't have any expectations with respect to, whether the hero will or will not want to see that film. So I then went and analyzed my examples in that way. Is the question is the question oriented? Or sort of is the preceding utterance, not just questions. I looked at all kinds of preceding speech acts, but do they have the same, does the response particle have the same polarity? Sorry, not from orientation, but simply the same grammatical polarity was what I looked at first. And we see that we is very overwhelmingly used to respond to positively polar utterances, and the other three particles much less so. And the pattern becomes much more clear if we take into account pragmatic harmony, because then we and Nini again pattern similarly. Because if we just look at grammatical polarity, they don't pattern similarly. Then Nini and non pattern more similarly than we and Nini. But if we look at pragmatic orientation, then we get the same pattern as before, with we and Nini going together, being pragmatically harmonious response particles, where non and si are pragmatically disharmonious up until the 16th century, when things start to change and Nini starts to drop out. So from the 16th century onwards, we see then the distribution starting to shift. And we saw that with the frequency of Nini drops very quickly. And so it seems that they increasingly converge in terms of the types of speech acts they can respond to. And non and Nini also start to converge in terms of pragmatic orientation. As you can see in the 17th century data, there non suddenly starts to respond more in a more harmonious way than it has. And then it seems to be that non starts to impinge on Nini's territory, starts to answer questions rather than just statements and directives, and it starts to be more pragmatically harmonious. And it impinges on Nini's territory more quickly than the other way around. So it sort of pushes Nini out. And starts to confine Nini to certain registers. It seems to become increasingly associated, particularly with lower class speech. And then in the 18th century, it suddenly starts to take on a new emphatic meaning in combination with que, the complementizer que, as in speak, he said, if you dare, have I been a libertine like you? Oh, que Nini, oh no, you're a saint. So, very emphatic no, which is suggestive of, it's trying sort of desperately to, it's a metaphor, of course, because the linguistic items in themselves don't do things, speakers do things, but it's like speakers are trying to find a use for Nini in which it is different from non. And so, because if there are two particles, then the assumption is that they must have different functions. And what then should the function of Nini be if it's no longer to distinguish between types of speech acts or pragmatically harmonious versus non-harmonious responses? And gradually, as I've said, Nini becomes all but obsolescent. It's basically gone in standard French today. So si. And that distinguishes it very clearly from we, which we saw almost 100%, like